Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where today we're talking about better offerings. It's a component of our newly released book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better, Avoiding the Pressure for Endless Growth to Build a Better Business and Life. Today I'm joined by Richard and Andres. Gentlemen, how are we all today?
Fantastic, and thanks for having us back.
Lovely day in Sydney.
Good to hear, good to hear. Better offering. It's interesting. I tell you, I can share with you and our listeners, provided our listeners don't tell anyone else, the struggle that I had between differentiating what is a better offering and what is better customers and how do we work on those. I really oscillated quite a lot when working on the book, and I think we kind of landed in somewhere that made good sense, I think, at the end. So let me kick off here by asking you, when you think about a better offering, what's a word or phrase that comes to mind?
Really, for me, will be distinctiveness. And why do I say that? Because we live in a world where there's always a similar offer of what we do. In any business that we are in, most businesses perhaps. So what are going to be the things that we do, that we offer to our clients, that actually are going to create that distinctiveness, that eventually they will notice? And it obviously bringing us back to what we discussed in the previous chapter about better customers. Why then, through our offers and the work that we do with our customers, we create that level of loyalty, distinctiveness.
Avoiding fads was the words that came to my mind, because fads suggest that you chase the next best thing, the brightest, the shiniest. And chapter is about the absolute opposite of that. It's about building something that is distinctive and different. So I'm looking forward to this chapter.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's interesting. Better offerings. So let's perhaps jump in. We're going to start by talking about mediocrity. So who's kicking us off here?
I'll be happy to. So, as you said, Brad, in the previous chapters, we talked about how teams drift towards toxicity, customers drift towards indifference, and now offerings drift towards mediocrity in their products and services. So, would you like to unpack that, please, a little bit more?
Yeah, as you said, teams drift towards toxicity. We did that in one of our earlier episodes. We discussed that. Last week, we spoke about customers drifting towards indifference. They're not really that fussed about you, and it just happens over time. And here we're talking about offerings, products and services. Well, they are drifting towards mediocrity. And so this is why we must work on the business rather than simply in the business. And that's the subcontext for all of the drift that we talk about. Drift in teams, drift in customers, drift in offerings, drift in financials. This is why we must work in the business and not simply in it, is to counter that drift and to work against it. And so drift shows up as complexity. And so we have too many lines. We start to think, well, let's bring on this new product to grow, because the subtext is the person who is enamored with bigger. They're excited about getting bigger. They want to get bigger rather than getting better. And so they bring on new products, new product lines. They start new offerings. They start bringing in new markets, new geographies, whatever it is, but they can only be good but not great at these things. They can create a good offering, but not a better offering. And so when you started the business as an owner-led company, you've got distinctiveness. You've got a real something about you, a real passion and soul for servicing and delivering that offering. But that begins to fade over time. And especially if you are learning your craft, learning entrepreneurship or business from a corporation, because a corporation is a system that transacts. A corporation is a system that offers mediocrity at scale. And so what we really begin to think is, when it comes to this drift, teams are starting to be spread thin. They're focusing on things that they can't really be the greatest at. And the way that we notice is customers can start to disengage when the offering starts to drift toward mediocrity.
Yeah, it brings to mind. I was in a workshop recently where the company who's unbelievably successful, growing, but they've been adding products and new versions of products. And the expression that somebody came up with in the middle of the workshop was incremental mediocrity. It was this, like, everything was a little bit better, but it was just, you hit the nail on the head. Just complexity. Managing all of these things was just driving the business absolutely to distraction. And the simplicity of shortening that list of products to 2 or 3 key things that they could absolutely be the best at was just a complete pivot. And it just renewed the whole sense of joy. It brought more soul back to the business when they realized this is what they've been doing for a period of time, and they needed to reject that. I was struck when I was reading this chapter about how the example of Boeing and its acquisition of McDonnell Douglas just illustrated this point of mediocrity so well. And I'd love you to sort of tell that story again for our listeners, Brad.
So Boeing is a fantastic company. They are one of the most successful engineering stories of the modern era, and there is so much value to be learned from that. And there was a point in time when Boeing acquired a competitor called McDonnell Douglas. Now, Boeing became so successful because they were engineering led. They put safety first. They put high quality engineering first. And really, the executives were engineers first and foremost, and they were an engineering company. Then when they merged with McDonnell Douglas, something changed and they became a little bit more focused on the financial side of things, and the culture became more corporate-like. And it's an interesting case because in the other examples, we're talking about owner-led companies that they can lose their soul. Led companies can lose their soul if they try to emulate a corporation. But Boeing's a fantastic case study because they were able to maintain their soul and their focus on engineering first culturally for so many years. And then something changed during this acquisition because they became focused on earnings per share and the MBAs took over. So they were previously led by engineers, and then they became more led by MBAs, to use a blunt instrument to describe the situation. So that top level executive conversation translated all the way down to perhaps offering product excellence as a secondary to cost cutting and a secondary to financial performance for the quarter. Now, again, a fantastic company, but this led to downstream effects where when they released a plane called the 737 MAX, there were some problems within the software because they didn't want to build a new plane. They didn't want to engineer a new plane in the entire manner because it would take too long and be too expensive. They just wanted to maintain the 737 that they had and then improve that to such a degree that they didn't have to go through all of the years to build a whole new plane that needed to go through regulatory approval. So they built software that would manage the fact that you had a newer and an older system, but it just didn't play out so well. And then what we saw was these crashes with the 737 MAX that subsequently occurred, which is all fairly well documented through the media and business media. So what I'm really talking about in this story is don't lose the soul of your better offering. And Boeing's better offering was engineering. They were an engineering first, and then they lost that somewhat and translated to become more like a corporation.
And I think we all heard these stories of companies, especially with the companies that we work with, that they get excited because things are going so well. So why don't just open a new geography or a new product line? And I remember having this conversation with the owner of one of the companies that we work with. And he said, okay, now I want to scale. Now I want to go to a new geography with 3 more product lines. And this is going to be great, right? And then the more we talked about, but can we be the best in our world at each of those things that we want to launch? And then maybe one perhaps was a good fit, but the other three that he had in mind, clearly it wasn't. And then the more that we would talk about it, the more he would realize, oh, this is definitely going to dilute then the profitability and probably what we can offer and the response from their customers. Now, Brad, obviously, you told the story, but in contrast, in the book, you also mentioned something else. You mentioned how Steve Jobs went back to Apple and then how he went from a wide spread of product lines to just 4. So why was that moment so pivotal? And how is that important in this world of bigger over better?
It's a fascinating story that of Apple at that point in time in its earlier days, because it started in a garage. It's a computer company led by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. And they treated their company like an owner-led company, not a corporation. We know that there was a famous meeting where Steve Jobs brought in John Scully to come in and be the CEO and run the company, but Scully was a corporate guy, and over time he obviously got rid of Steve Jobs, and then Scully continued to run it like a corporation, adding more and more products that they could only be good but not great at. And so then we fast forward to the time where Steve Jobs sold Next, his other computer company, came back to Apple. And then what happened was there was this one product meeting that Steve Jobs was in, and he recounts it, and I tell the story in the book, where he said, we've got about 70 products and we're losing money on all of them, and we can't be great at any of them. And he said, we need to cut all of the products, and we just need to have 4 great products. We need to have a consumer desktop and a consumer laptop or notebook, and we need to have a pro desktop and a pro laptop, and that's it. And there are people in that meeting who were just shocked and stunned. For example, the printer people, they made printers, and the printer business just was like a money-making machine. They made so much money out of that, and they couldn't believe it. Why are you going to cut off all of these products? Because they couldn't be the best at them. And it's the same in owner-led companies. Like, we've got to be very hard about what can we actually be the best at, because if you continue to get bigger and to scale with mediocre products, it is a real problem.
Yeah, scaling mediocrity. That was another sentence that just jumped out when I was reading this, because it is what you see in corporations, but we try to resist when we work in owner-led companies. It's interesting, though, because when I was reading this chapter, there's a phrase we often use in our workshop, good enough. But you very viscerally sort of argue against good enough in the context of offerings. I think for our listeners, it's probably worth unpacking why you did that, Brad, because they've been trained with working with us in workshops that we often use good enough in the context of a workshop. We certainly wouldn't apply that when we're talking about a better offering.
Yeah, good enough. Good enough is a phrase that we do use all the time. And that is because we can be in a 1 or a 2-day strategic planning workshop with a leadership team, and we can get really fixated on getting a particular agenda item to be perfect. And perfection is the enemy. And perfection is the enemy when you are in that environment, because we can debate and debate and debate for hours. And then in 90 days' time, we can come back to that workshop, and then we can be saying, oh, I thought about it. It didn't really make sense anyway. Pardon me. Or we can then get to the end of the workshop and we've lost a lot of valuable time because 1 or 2 people have been fixated on a particular item that didn't really matter. So good enough is an excellent phrase within a workshop that enables us to progress through the agenda, knowing that we're aiming not for perfection in 1 day, because a business plan is never done in one. We're aiming to compound over quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter, and that we will come back and build and evolve. That's why our business is called Evolution Partners, because building a business that compounds is an evolution over time. So you can't think that we need to get this particular plan on this particular day perfect, because there won't be another, because there will, and that is the whole point of it, is to grow and evolve over time. That's in contrast to selling a product in the market for an owner-led company. Because if you're competent at something, are not the best at it. Competence means that you are able to sell it, but you're not actually great at it. And when we talk about good enough, we're good enough to be able to sell something in a market, but it's quite a problem, because corporations can be good enough because they are transactional. And I recount our conversation last week about the better customers. Corporations are transactional. They deal with customers in a transactional manner. But corporations will be able to scale mediocrity because they have the size and the systems to absorb it. There's a particular phrase in the book that I talk about where, imagine it's Christmas Day and you've bought a present for your kids, and they open up that present and it doesn't even last a day before it breaks. That's what corporations do, and they should hang their head in shame at that, okay? Because it's good enough to sell, okay, but it's not good enough to for an owner-led company to be able to scale. So the systems that corporations have to be able to manage and deal with that. For example, those toys that break, only 50% of people, or whatever the number is, are going to actually go and take that toy back. So they're like, well, we're making a profit on it anyway. It doesn't matter. Though we'll get rid of that line item, we'll bring in another one. But owner-led companies don't have those safety nets in place. They don't have that ability. So the mediocrity that is good enough in an offering can drain the energy of a leader and destroy the distinctiveness. And good enough really becomes easy to substitute. So the customer sees a good enough offering and they don't really care.
That's gold. That's gold, because it was on Friday that I actually had a conversation with, it was a workshop with the leadership team, and the question came up. So what are the other companies, the big companies making a lot of money? What are they doing in their offerings? And that was a drift. That was it. That was the moment where we thought, if we try to copy those corporations, what would happen? So I want to bring this gold moment to this conversation, and maybe ask Brad, why is copying these corporations and how they design their offerings, why is it so dangerous for the owner-led companies to do that?
We look, as an owner-led company, we look at a corporation and think that things are the same, but they're not. A corporation has the scale and the legal department and the systems and processes and stage gates to be able to bring out an offering that they can be mediocre at. And they're very good at being mediocre at a lot of those products. They are good enough to sell it, but they're not better. And if we're only good enough, it becomes a problem, because when we're copying that, we don't have that same infrastructure. The decision, first of all, won't be going through the same kind of decision-making formula that the corporation with a system has. And so to actually release it, we can, as impulsive risk takers in an owner-led company, say, that sounds like a really good idea. Let's start selling calculators, or let's start selling push bikes, or whatever is the thing that we think of. And then we can bring that out as impulsive risk takers. And why are we doing that? Because we're looking at the corporation that does it and we think, well, they do it, so we can do it. But we just don't have the ability to do that. And let's be fair, a lot of the times corporations can make major mistakes bringing out offerings that are just good enough. So it really blows back on the owner, where because they're only good enough, it doesn't really connect with the customer, the offering. It doesn't really bring that long-term value and meaningful that we spoke about in the last chapter, or meaningful interaction. So we get these bloated businesses with lots of SKUs or line items or products. We're not really great at them. And because we're not really great at them, the teams that we work with don't really care about them. They'll work on them, but they're not really experts at them perhaps. And so then they don't really care. And then the customers don't really care. And then we don't really care.
Yeah. It's interesting because, building off of that idea, one of the things we often work with our clients and workshops on, probably when we very first start talking, is we talk about this concept of being best at. What can you be the best at in the world at? And we do that because we try to anchor them in that thinking of that's the starting point of differentiation. That's the starting point of marshaling everything in the service of being the best at something. But as we've used in the previous chapters, you talk about that as being one part of the sort of, if you would call it, the offering doom loop, and this rejection of almost or investing in things that we can't be best at. Can you play out the rest of that doom loop for our listeners? Because I think this moves beyond just comparing to corporations, and this really gets into what happens inside an owner-led business.
Yeah. So first of all, best at is a concept from Jim Collins through Good to Great and the hedgehog concept. What's your core purpose? What's your economic engine or your profit per X? And then what can you be the best at? And then focus at the center of that, a hedgehog. It's an elegant and beautiful concept I encourage all of our listeners to become very familiar with. So when we really think about what can we be the best at, and then we think about what does it mean to create a unique and valuable position in the market that is different from competitors, which is the definition of strategy from Michael Porter, we can then think about our offering and why is our offering important? Well, the bigger offering doom loop starts when we invest time or money to sell products that we can't be the best at. So that is born of a bigger mindset rather than a better mindset. So if we really want to grow this business, the bigger mindset might think, if we really want to do something great, if we want to build a big and great business, we need to sell more products because we can't scale using our existing customers fast enough. We can't scale using our existing products fast enough. The market that we've got at the moment, it isn't going to make us big enough, quick enough. We need to bring on more products. And so we bring on products that we can only be good at or mediocre at, to be a bit more blunt, and not the best at. Now, if we do that, what happens is poor execution. So we can't be the best. The customers respond accordingly. And as a result, we get disappointing results. And perhaps what was born of ego originally, thinking, well, if I'm so good at selling calculators, I should be equally as good at selling bicycles. Well, it doesn't kind of work like that if you can't be the best at it. Once you go through poor execution, we can't help but have disappointing results. And as we go through that that doom loop a little bit more, and if we have disappointing results, our profit per fixed cost drops. So for the fixed costs across the business, the profit goes down because we've had disappointing results chasing things that we can't be the best at. And when that drops, we can't help because we've got a bigger mindset with trying to respond by having bigger growth plans. Now that we're selling calculators and bicycles that we can't be the best at, let's start selling cupboards, because we can't be the best at that, but that's the answer so that we can continue to grow. So we invest, going back to the top of the doom loop, we invest to sell more products that we can't be the best at. And so the doom loop continues and continues. And this is the essence of the bigger mindset when it comes to a bigger offering.
It makes me think about one of the conversations that I had with one of the companies that we work with. And they offer 3 really good products, probably distinct products, I would say. And they thought about, well, how about this 4th one that almost like everyone is doing it? So the way that they structured the company, it was around those products. So think about each division or each vertical, it will be directly linked to a product so they can focus on servicing better those customers. So my question was, what you're thinking about this, would you create a division for this specific product. And they started to debate a little bit. And after 20 minutes, they were frustrated because they said, everything tells us, no, we wouldn't. And then obviously the conversation ended up with, well, it's tempting, but we know that we shouldn't because we know that we cannot be the best at. So, and one of the key things that came in the conversation is that, well, because everyone is doing it. So just to flip that to this conversation, Brad, you mentioned this doom loop creates more and more and more products, but you mentioned that the problem is that they might be easy to copy. And that is where the real problem kicks in. So I guess what makes an offering hard to copy and why constant evolution really matters?
Well, strategy isn't setting a goal. Some people might say, what's your strategy for 3 years? And they'll say, we want to get to $50 million in revenue. Well, that's not a strategy. That's a revenue target. A strategy is the creation of a unique and valuable position in the market that is different from competitors. And ideally, that's also growing your gross profit dollars or your gross profit percent quarter after quarter after quarter. You're becoming more valuable, and that's creating a more valuable company and the kind of company that people want to own and that you should hopefully want to own. So when we can only be good at something but not great, when we start selling calculators that everyone else sells and you can probably import from China or wherever it is that look pretty much the same, and that's all we do, well, there's no value in that because I can go and buy the same thing. The only lever that you've got is price. And so that is easy to copy because I can sell it cheap, just as cheap as you can. And then maybe you've got a little bit lower overheads or something, but it doesn't really make any difference whatsoever. So easy, it speaks about this idea of, do we have a unique offering and is that offering evolving over time? And so we have these 4 areas in a 2x2. And the vertical and horizontal axis is the uniqueness of the offering and how well it evolves. So these create something that is easy to copy or hard to copy. In it, when it's easy to copy, we've got surface level features. It kind of, maybe we've got a different name on it or it's a different color or something, but anyone else can really come and copy that. But hard to copy means that there's systems and there's customer experience. There's the small little refinements that are very hard to copy. Now, if you just did that once, that's fine. But quarter after quarter after quarter with continuous improvement, it means that people can't catch up. Eventually you get to a time, and we've seen this with our customers, where people say, I can't get to that point as the competitor. They can't catch up. And that's really what we're looking for. So then we think that the most important competition isn't the competitors, it's who you were last quarter.
Yeah, and I think the extension of this idea is this centered around this idea of compounding, right? So the whole proposition, I think, that really jumped out at me in this chapter was the fact that if you extend on this idea of uniqueness and evolution as, if you will, dimensions of how to build this sort of compounding differentiation matrix that you come up with in the book, Brad. It results in some really interesting thinking as you explore each of those quadrants. So maybe for our listeners, perhaps what we could do is take those dimensions of uniqueness and evolution and bring that to life in terms of those quadrants and what we're trying to achieve with our offerings.
Well, why do companies drift toward mediocrity? Because maybe they've created uniqueness, but they stop evolving that uniqueness. Or maybe they're evolving, but they're not evolving toward being unique. And so if we want to avoid the drift toward mediocrity for our offering, we want to continue to evolve and we want to protect and go deeper on that uniqueness. It's not easy, right? It takes patience. It takes a long-term view. You can't just be focused on this quarter's view, but that's a little bit of the special sauce of an owner-led company. I know the Tugboat Institute, who I'm a huge fan of, they focus on really building 100 companies And they say that the only advantage of an owner-led company or a family business is that it can take a 100-year view, whereas a corporation can't. So coming back to your question, there are these 4 quadrants against unique and evolving. And the first is you're not unique and you're not evolving. And that's what we call a commodity zone, or it's a commodity offering. You are only competing on price and it's indistinguishable. Next, we have what we call the efficiency trap, where, and if you're a fan of lean, and I love lean, this is where some advocates of lean can get stuck, because they're focused on operations and they're trying to become more and more and more and more efficient. So they're evolving, but they're not becoming more unique over time. They're getting faster, they're getting cheaper, but they're still forgettable. So they're focused on the internals, but not necessarily the externals as well. Next, we have a unique offering, but it's not evolving, so it's stagnant. And this is what we call the diminishing advantage. So it was special, and people talk about how it was so special, but it is beginning to have that drift toward mediocrity because others can catch up. They're not evolving. And then finally, we have the compounding differentiation, which is we've got an offering that is unique and it's continuing to evolve. And that makes it the hardest to copy because it's unique, first of all, but this quarter, it's more unique ever so slightly than it was last quarter and last year and 2 years ago. So it's continuing that journey.
It makes me reflect on how can I actually go and probably owner-led companies, these leaders who are listening to this, how can they use this to maybe think or reflect about their offerings over time? And they can use these 2 by 2 to plot each of their offerings and then consistently measure against that. That's great. To be honest, I cannot even wait until I actually use it once we release the book and then make it big and have a deep conversation. Now, we spoke about the doom loop, this bigger offering doom loop, and that impact that creates in these owner-led companies. Now, on the flip side, the better offering flywheel. So how's that breaking that cycle, let's say, of the doom loop and actually create compounding momentum?
So we draw upon compounding differentiation, the concept that we spoke, where we're unique and evolving over time. And then we think, how do we compound that? And so we start with a better mindset rather than a bigger mindset. So let's not bring something on unless we can be the best at it. So at 12 o'clock on this flywheel, we start by invest in what you can do better than any other business. If you're going to invest time or money or resources, invest there where you can be the best at. If we do that, we can't help but execute with unwavering focus because we can be the best at. Because we have the ability to do that work that very few people can do. Imagine if you were a calculator manufacturer and seller, to use my earlier example. Imagine if you assembled the best team of calculator builders and you did the best possible job that you can do that. And I picked that intentionally because it's a highly commoditized product. Well, could you make something that is more meaningful? We could debate that for half an hour, but whatever your product or offering is, we've got to think about how can we invest on what we can be better at, and how can we execute with unwavering focus. If we do that, we can't help but have results begin to improve because we've got the best people, we're doing the best work in the right manner. And if we do that, we can grow the offering. If we've got better offering and the results are improving, we can't help but grow that offering. And then we are growing our profit per fixed cost, enabling the fueling of further investment. And then we go back to 12 o'clock where we invest in what we can do better than any other business. So we think about the doom loop where we're trying to bring in more products and more geographies, a bigger offering, doing more things that we can only be mediocre at. That thins out the profits because we just can't be the best at it, and customers react accordingly. Inversely, in the flywheel, what we're really doing is say, let's own that niche. Let's focus in on where we're at. It reminds me of a retail customer that we work with that was based in Perth, probably, $20 million business. Now, they could have expanded from Perth to Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane a few years before, but they hadn't earned the right to do that. They needed to build that offering to be better at that. And one thing about the business people in Perth who've expanded over east, very, very conscious that a lot of people have tried to do it and come back with their tail between their legs because they didn't earn the right to operate in the other larger and perhaps more sophisticated markets. And so for this particular retailer, they took their time, they continued to build a better offering for the customer. And then, so when they did launch a few years later, they had such a strong and compelling offering that customers responded really well, and they've they've consequentially been very successful in those other markets.
And I like the idea that what you mentioned at the beginning, Brad, how you went from distinguishing customers and offerings and then these two chapters. And that's probably because they're so interlinked. When we are designing better offerings, we have to understand better and better our customers to then go back and continuously evolve those offerings. When I'm having conversations with clients, and they bring this offering conversation, I cannot help but just going back to customer conversation and say, well, how well do we understand them? So then we can evolve our offering to the point where it's that level of distinctiveness, perhaps, and that impacts at the same time the loyalty of the customer.
I think that what means a lot to me is the conversation that one has with people who look at the title. Don't judge a book by its cover is what we've all heard before. But people who look at the title and they go, oh, yeah, I know a friend and they had a business and they had like 20 employees and then they were miserable. And so then what they did is they just brought it back to 1 or 2 employees and now they're really happy. And it's like, that's great and good for them, but that's not what the book is about at all. It's about building a better business, and a better business will compound and it will grow. But hopefully, having now for our listeners listened to a few of these episodes, the emergence of the definition of better is becoming more clearer. It's not about size. It's about actually having a business that is rewarding and that can produce better results and that you will be happier with. And I can tell you, if you're only mediocre at a offering and you're not the best at it, it's a very different feeling as an owner in how you interact with the business. And we've said this in other episodes that one of our jobs often that we find ourselves in is trying to help an owner in an owner-led company to fall back in love with their business. And the offering is, whilst the teams and the customers are a very important part of it, the offering is something that we can't lose track of. Because if you don't have a meaningful interaction with the offering, if you can't be the best at it, you can lose that passion and it just feels very transactional. So that really brings us to the end of this episode, talking about better offerings. So any reflections on better offerings? Richard, maybe I'll start with you. One of the things that you've said, I think it might have been at the beginning of one of the episodes, it could have been the Better Customers episode. You said that the better customers and the better offerings were 2 of your favorite sections. So as we close out the better offering, any reflections on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to knit back together why I said that, for me, why I loved these 2 episodes, and particularly this one, was because we separated the two. Because too often we mix up the conversation as an owner-led business and working with these clients, is that we try to make them interchangeable, and they're not. You have to explore them separately before you can put them together. So I'm completely happy now with it, now that we've got to these 2 episodes, because it feels like we've done both topics a really good justice.
Great. Andres, any reflections on better offerings?
Yeah, absolutely. Not only that they're interlinked with better customers, but probably the one takeaway that our listeners can go and immediately just use this differentiation matrix, the compounding differentiation matrix that you explained, to start reflecting on their offering right now. And how was it different from last year and the previous year and the previous year?
Yeah, that's great. So Yeah, hopefully thank you for making it to the end of this episode. I suppose it's not everyone that makes it to the end of a podcast episode, but hopefully, you've gained something today in the better offerings section. Next week, we'll be talking about better financials. So if you build a better team, better customers, better offering, we can then begin to think about better financials. What results from that? The work in those three areas, and then what do you do with it, and how do you think about it? A good chat to be had next week with Better Financials. Thank you, chaps, for joining me today. It's been a valuable and interesting conversation. Do enjoy your day, everyone, and I look forward to chatting to you again next week.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed the episode. Please be sure to like and to subscribe for future episodes. And of course, this is part of the 7-part series releasing my new book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better. Be sure to join in next week for the next episode.